Do you remember that game, The Last of Us Part 2? The one that came out and wasn't controversial at all? Everybody loved it? I'm just kidding. The discourse surrounding that game was a dumpster fire. But why was it such a dumpster fire? What was it about that game that made everybody lose their collective minds? That's the question that I want to explore in this video. Because people didn't just dislike this game. They felt genuine hatred for it and the people who worked on it. And this video is mostly going to be about the people who disliked the game. I already made my review, which was pretty positive, so I don't feel like there's much point in me, going through those opinions again. I'll give my thoughts on it here and there, and when it applies to what I'm currently talking about, but I'm not just gonna go ahead and review the game again. So anyways, sit back, grab a snack, and let's get into why The Last of Us Part 2 was so controversial. If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose my mind. To understand why people hated The Last of Us Part 2 so much, I think it's important to understand their relationship with the first installment. June 2013, The Last of Us released to almost universal acclaim, becoming one of the most beloved games of all time. And for good reason, I think. The story of Joel's redemption through Ellie is pretty fantastic. Not only are the characters compelling as individuals, but the relationship developed between them is incredibly endearing as well. It's a simple yet effective game that gives us two of the most beloved video game characters of all time. People became really attached to them, myself included. The relationship was so well developed that players felt like they were a part of it too. It's as if Joel was all of our adopted dads. So just keep that incredibly strong attachment in mind as we continue. December 2016, The Last of Us Part 2 is officially announced at PSX. To announce the game, they showed off a pretty fantastic CGI trailer. We learned that Ellie is on a quest for revenge, and people were even theorizing that Joel was dead at that point. There wasn't really any backlash, aside from maybe some people just thinking that The Last of Us didn't need a sequel. I also kind of felt that way, but I was still optimistic. And I definitely do think that, for the most part, people were excited to see what Naughty Dog would do with a second installment. October 2017. Sony shows off another trailer at Paris Games Week. And this is actually the beginning of some controversy being associated with the game. The trailer showcases a woman being hung, a girl's arms are being broken via hammer, and arrows fly into bodies in very graphic ways. Basically, you are likely to go, ugh, many times while watching this trailer. And people were actually questioning whether or not the violence was too much. I didn't play the game, but after watching the game, I would say that the violence serves a narrative purpose, but honestly, it is a lot, and it's totally fair to just not want to be exposed to that stuff. But honestly, this controversy pretty much began and ended with this trailer, because after this point, nobody really cared about the violence. The other controversy had to do with the woman being hung. Why were some people upset by this character, you may be wondering to yourself? Well, it was because she was a woman. I could have ended it right there, but it was because she was also yoked. We'll talk more in depth about that topic later on in the video, but you know how a certain sect of gamers can be. But while these two controversies were a thing, they weren't overshadowing the conversation around the game. At this point in time, the general consensus surrounding the game was positive. June 2018, Sony releases a gameplay trailer at E3, and yeah, there really weren't any controversies that came from it. From what I remember, people unanimously just went, wow, that looks amazing. There may have been some people who were malding about Ellie being a lesbian and giving Dina a smoochy smooch, but they were definitely drowned out by the people praising the game. September 2019, Sony held another one of their State of Play events where they showed off another trailer that was, interestingly enough, not controversial at the time, but would become controversial later on. But we'll get to that. The trailer was generally well received at the time and pretty much confirmed that the game would follow a revenge plot. It heavily hinted at Dina being killed and Ellie going after her killers with Joel. So people were totally in at this point in time. Okay, so I wanted to give that sort of timeline of events so that I could showcase what the conversation around The Last of Us 2 was like before that fateful day in April 2020. Yes, I am of course talking about the leaks. A lot of the major plot points and twists were leaked and made public like a month and a half before the game came out. There was conversation about maybe it being a disgruntled Naughty Dog employee, but in actuality it appears to have been done by hackers who hacked into Naughty Dog servers. But however it got leaked. Now here is the final warning. If you do not want to be spoiled, leave. So the leaks revealed that Joel dies. Not only does he die, but he gets killed via golf club. But it doesn't end there, folks, because you have to play as his killer Abby for the second half of the game. Not only do you have to play as her, but the game reaches a climax where you have to fight Ellie as Abby. I mean, the leaks revealed a lot. Like, full-on cutscenes. And this is unfortunate. Whether you think this game is the second coming of Christ, or you think that Neil Druckmann came to your house and beat your actual father to death with a golf club, I think you can empathize with the developers who spent years working on this game to just have it be spoiled for people like this. And needless to say, people were not happy about the contents of this leak.
How dare they kill off my video game daddy Joel? What? They're gonna make me play as the lady who did it? Even though I haven't seen these things in the context of the game, I'm gonna preemptively say the game is bad now. That is a totally reasonable course of action.
Yeah, that was definitely the most disappointing response to the leaks. That is all the people making declarative statements that the game is bad without having played the game. Like, you shouldn't just look at isolated scenes and then formulate your opinion on something. You should experience the game for yourself first so that you understand the context of those scenes. You should see what came before those scenes and what happened as a result of those scenes. And this whole situation reminds me of that movie Marriage Story. There's a scene where the two main characters are having a heated argument. And someone on Twitter posted that scene on its own with like a little caption that says like, look at this over-the-top scene with the goofy acting. But the thing is that there's so much tension in that movie that really builds up to that scene. If you just watch that scene on its own, then yeah, maybe two people yelling at each other like that may seem silly. But you need to see it in context to really be able to judge it. But to be clear, you might watch the entirety of Marriage Story and still think that that scene is poorly acted. You may play The Last of Us 2 and still think it's bad. But don't watch out-of-context scenes or read a story synopsis and then make your judgment based off of that. Movies and games are holistic. The many parts make up the whole. So please don't develop your opinion on The Last of Us Part 2 if you haven't played or in my case, watched it. But anyways, the game leaked. Idiots made up their mind without playing it. Let's move on. There were some other trailers and gameplay showcases, but honestly, I think we should just move on to June 12th, 2020. This is the day that the critic reviews came out. And they were overwhelmingly positive. Now, did this make all the people who had already irrationally made up their minds go, well, you know, I'm a little worried about the game after the leaks, but I'm going to go into it with an open mind and give it a chance? I mean, what do you think? Clearly, the critics were either paid off or they'll just give any game with representation a 10 out of 10. The possibility of people just genuinely thinking the game is good is non-existent. June 19th, 2020. This is the day that the game was finally released. And yeah, the discourse was still terrible. I mean, I honestly think that it was worse than The Last Jedi. Like, people were upset by The Last Jedi, and there was definitely bickering, but I don't think that there was vitriolic rage on the level that was associated with The Last of Us Part 2. But now that we're here, and we know how we got here, let's talk about the game itself and why it's so gosh darn divisive. One of the reasons the game is so divisive is because of, well, the story. People will talk about how they want blockbuster franchises to take risks, but in reality, people don't want that. People want safe stories, and they don't want their perception of their beloved IPs to be challenged. The Last of Us 2 is a ballsy game that takes a lot of risks and tells a challenging story, and I think that a lot of the people who dislike this game just don't like that they're being challenged. These are people who didn't want a risky sequel. They just wanted to see Joel and Ellie go on another adventure. And it is made very clear very quickly that this game is not that. The first Last of Us is definitely sad and the world it sets up is horrible, but the relationship of Joel and Ellie still make the experience of playing it enjoyable for the most part. The game rarely challenges you to question the actions of Joel. During the first installment, the player is on a heroic quest to save the world and recover the soul of this broken man by bonding with Ellie. It's not until the very end that the game really challenges you to question the actions of Joel. Throughout the entirety of The Last of Us 2, the game calls on you to question Joel and Ellie, and that made a lot of people uncomfortable. It's a challenging narrative that's really hard to watch and makes you think and reflect. I personally thought it was brilliant, but there were a lot of people that clearly weren't having any of it. But it's not just the story. These characters are so beloved that seeing them go through the physical and emotional trauma that the game puts Joel and Ellie through genuinely affected players. When Joel was murdered, it was like seeing your own father get murdered. I know it's silly to say that about a fictional character, but that is how much of an impact that first game had on people. And you know what? There's really nothing wrong with not vibing with that. Everyone is gonna react to art differently. I was also disturbed by the death of Joel, but that feeling that I got, that just deep sadness and anger and, desire for revenge, only made the game better in my opinion. However, there are people who don't just merely dislike the game. These are people who don't just disagree with the decisions Neil Druckmann made. These are people who appear to think that Neil Druckmann actually murdered a loved one of theirs. They don't just think the game was poorly executed, they think that it was a personal offense. And these people couldn't direct their anger at Abby because she's fictional, so they had to direct it at Naughty Dog. And of course they went out and harassed Naughty Dog employees, and all of that is incredibly cringe and pathetic. And it's kind of interesting because the game left such an impact on these people that they felt genuine anger. And I don't know if I can say that it makes the game good, but it certainly makes it effective. Much like Ellie, these people were blinded by grief. But unlike Ellie, they could never reach a point where they could learn to forgive and, see what the rest of the game has to say. But anyways, that's sort of one of the sects of people who dislike The Last of Us Part 2. These are the people who were so disturbed by the death of Joel that it basically ruined the rest of the game for them. But again, just to be clear, if you're one of those people who were just disturbed by the story being told, that's fine. If you went and, took it a step further and harassed the developers, you are cringe. Another criticism of the game didn't really have anything to do with the game itself, but rather with the advertising for the game. If you recall, one of the trailers really made it seem like Joel was going with Ellie on her adventure. To do that, they altered one of the cutscenes to include Joel. They basically replaced Jesse with Joel. And this marketing trick was a pretty big point of contention for a lot of people, and I honestly can't argue with them. It is, by definition, false advertising. It's just that I don't really mind being lied to when it comes to trailers. I like being tricked and then surprised by the final product. But again, I do think that it is valid to be upset when you're being lied to about a product that you're buying for $60. Okay, so now let's move on to the weirder contentions people have with this game. Yes, we will now be discussing the culture war nonsense. Let's look back at Abby. She, of course, is the character from the second trailer that almost got hung. As we noted, she also killed Joel. And that alone will get people upset because, of course, Joel is our favorite video game daddy. But there's another element here. Abby is a woman. Ew, cringe, I know, but it goes even one step further. She's also really buff. And that led to some really gross discourse. There are a lot of people who are weirdly obsessed with how muscular Abby is. These are people who, whenever criticizing the game, feel the need to bring up Abby being muscular in a really demeaning way. Like referring to her as an it or a monster and, just stuff like that. It's pretty messed up. Especially considering she's based off of real people. And I'm sure some female bodybuilders are already feeling self-conscious about themselves because they don't have the traditional body types for women. And yeah, it's just pretty pathetic on the side of these people whose penises fell off when they saw Abby. You know what? I'm gonna say it. I think Abby's hot. I kind of want her to choke me out. Is that weird? I'm gonna say no. Oh, and there are actually people out there who have tried to scientifically prove that it would be impossible for a woman to attain that physique during a zombie apocalypse.
You would have to work out constantly and eat X amount of calories in order to make those gains.
Firstly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, it's not real. It's just a video game. Secondly, the game actually goes out of its way to show that the group that Abby's with has a fully functioning gym and plenty of food. And thirdly, none of you have ever cared about realism in this series until now that there's a muscular woman. I mean, this is a franchise where bullet wounds can be healed by bandages. These games have never prioritized realism over their narrative, and these people have never had a problem with it until now. I also saw people mauling over this scene where Ellie refers to a sandwich made to her by someone as a bigot sandwich. The guy who made it had confronted her and Dina the night before when they kissed because he's a bigot. Thus, a sandwich made by him would be a bigot sandwich. And this is a moment in the game that made people flip out. Even though I didn't think much of it when it happened, all around the world, there were grown men balling their fists in rage because Ellie wouldn't accept this sandwich. They deemed this to be a moment where Naughty Dog and Neil Druckmann were inserting their SJW politics. And to those people, I would say, yeah, kind of, but also, why is that a bad thing? Can I just defend Ellie here for a second? Her rejecting the sandwich was totally reasonable. I'm a Mexican/Puerto Rican. If I were dancing with an Asian person, for example, and then we kissed, and some guy comes over and tries to interrupt us because he's against, interracial relationships, I would not want to associate with that person. If that guy came up to me the next day and was like, "Hey man, I'm sorry, but I made you this sandwich," I probably wouldn't accept it. I would tell him to leave me alone. There would be nothing there to reconcile. He's just a racist. The idea that it's unacceptable for Ellie to say, "Leave me alone, I don't want your sandwich," is ridiculous to me. A lesbian shouldn't be expected to associate with a homophobe. I feel like what I just said should be common sense, but apparently it's not. The fact that this was such a controversial moment in the game that I felt like I should include it in this video is kind of sad. Anyways, the last controversial thing in this game is Lev being trans. Now, thankfully, the backlash wasn't anywhere near as extreme as with the death of Joel or, Abby's physique. And I think that's probably just because the backlash to Abby was so great that there just really wasn't much energy left to direct towards Lev. But, I still saw the usual nonsense of
It feels forced. I feel like they're forcing their agenda on me, man.
I saw some people saying,
Why would anybody worry about their gender identity during a zombie apocalypse?
firstly, that's not how it works. People don't just decide their gender identity because they're bored. And if you want to say that gender identity shouldn't matter, then I would say that that's pretty based. Everyone should be agender in zombie media. But I don't know, it honestly just feels like you just can't tell stories about LGBT issues. No matter what, people are gonna say it's forced. When what they really mean is, I don't want to see these stories being told. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers all the reasons why people were mauling over this game. So what does it all mean? Well, I think it means that the discourse surrounding this game was kind of all over the place. I don't think it's fair to say that all of the people who dislike this game are sexist, homophobe, whatever. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who claim that they aren't. But a lot of their arguments weirdly have to do with Abby being too muscular or Naughty Dog having a political agenda, as if Neil Druckmann were coming to their houses and sticking SJW propaganda directly up their anuses. It's like, you know what? I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that there's more going on here than you just not thinking the story was well crafted. I think it's pretty safe to say that on some level, these people just don't want these stories being told. If you're somebody who just genuinely thought the game was bad, you thought the themes were shallow. Maybe you thought they should have gone back and forth between Abby and Ellie's story instead of having you play one big chunk as Ellie and vice versa. You're totally cool. But when I and others talk about the more problematic sex of The Last of Us 2 critiques, don't respond to them by saying,
Not everyone who didn't like The Last of Us 2 is sexist.
I'm aware of that. So if you're genuinely not one of those people, there's no real reason why you should get defensive over it. It's like seeing these people just fly into the line of fire to play defense for the more problematic sect of Last of Us 2 haters. I don't know, makes me wonder about the true intentions or the true beliefs of these people. But anyways, whatever your opinion on the game is, I think you still have to appreciate just how big of an impact it's had. I mean, I can't remember the last movie, game, or TV show that has just made people feel on this level. Whether it be anger or sadness or... Actually, no, those are the only two emotions you'll feel playing this game. And I generally don't feel emotions, so this game is a pretty big achievement. So what do you feel about all this? Do you love the game? Do you hate the game? Have your feelings changed overall? What are your thoughts on all the culture war nonsense? And I mean, I don't know. I hope that you can just kind of understand that even if you're someone who dislikes the game, but you're not a sexist or a homophobe, like, there are people out there like that, and it's important to call those people out. You don't have to feel personally attacked, and I hope that you don't feel like lumped into that group whenever they're criticized. But anyways, let me know all of your feelings in the comments below, and goodbye.